Hey everybody, it's Chris and Rick Talk Guitars. Hi Chris,
Hi,
see
Rick.
you in your shed with all your cool gear and your posters. You got some mood lighting going on too that I like.
I really do.
Kind of cool. Chris and I are always a day late and a dollar short, so we thought we'd talk about Eddie Van Halen like a few weeks after he died, or was it last week or
That was a while ago,
a
right?
while ago? Last year?
No,
Was
it
it?
wasn't that long ago. It was
Oh, okay.
maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks.
Yeah. So gosh, okay, maybe about a month ago.
I should look that up while you go ahead. Keep talking. I'm going to look that up.
All right, I'll keep talking. Yeah, Eddie Van Halen, man, R.I.P. You know, he came along like everybody else, man. I was at a party and somebody put that damn record on, and it's like, shit, what is he doing? And I couldn't figure it out. It was cool. I liked that whole first album, first one and second one. I was a young, long-haired stoner rocker guitar player, and so it just slapped me in the face a couple times, man, when I first heard it. What's the first one you heard, dude, when you were young?
I remember this very clearly. It was probably in like 78, maybe early 79. I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I went to a party. And it was kind of a lame party. It wasn't very big, and it wasn't, I just remember it being kind of lame. And the only record they played that whole night was the first Van Halen record. And so I remember just being, my jaw hitting the floor listening to those guitar parts because I had been playing guitar for a while.
Yeah.
But kind of burned that record out in one single night because they just played it over and over and over again. But then I got that record shortly after that. So, and that was my window into Van Halen, the first record.
That's cool. I think that's for me, I think that's the best way to be introduced to that band, because you and I both like those first two albums, and then the rest are like pretty hit or miss, I think. But those first two, I think, are solid in terms of just being good representations of that lineup of that band, and just they're young and they're full of piss and vinegar. And I love those two albums, man. I like you too. I remember vividly in high school, this friend of mine drove me to school. He had this little old brown Toyota Celica, and he had a cassette of that first album. And I replayed Ain't Talking About Love so many times that he stopped taking me to school because he was tired of that song.
It's weird because I admittedly didn't, I got that record and I played it maybe, a dozen more times. And, then I kind of put it to the back of my record. I didn't really connect with the music of Van Halen until much, much later. I don't know what it was. I mean, because I'm a guitar player, I should have just been like, I was blown away, but it just didn't really speak to me. I didn't really like the songs that much. What I didn't like about them specifically was I didn't like the show tuniness of them, like the show tuning backing vocals and just, the David Lee Roth like shtick.
Yeah.
I didn't really get. I wasn't ready. There's so many times when there's stuff out that I'm not ready for. And until I am, it goes over my head, right? I missed the point. And I was very sensitive and still am to anything I perceive as like parlor tricks.
Right.
And like take You Really Got Me. Back then I thought, what, this song doesn't really rock that much more than the Kinks version. It just has more parlor tricks in it. You know what I mean? So I really tried to connect with the record. I didn't until many, many years later. But even back then, I knew that an important thing about Eddie Van Halen and the band Van Halen was it gave a whole generation of young guitar players the opportunity to answer that question. I wonder what it was like for guitar players when they saw Hendrix.
Yeah.
Because it was like that generation's version of something mind-blowing that was going on that came from nowhere and just kind of like stood guitar playing on its, upside down. So that was never lost on me. I never, ever, even though I wasn't a huge fan of the music then, I never thought it wasn't something that was like incredible. It just didn't speak to me. I was more a different type of rock thing was what I was all about back then. Until seriously, probably in the 2000s when I started revisiting my rock past and collecting records. And then I got into Van Halen and I got it by then. I'm like, the things that I didn't like about that band, the show tuniness, like David Lee Roth's off the hook kind of like cheese, was like I loved about the band then. You know what I mean? I got it. I really got what the band was about all these years later. So, I think it's great. And yeah, I focus kind of more on the first two records, and I love those, and I'll always own those and always play them. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, I think that's the main thing. My takeaway too was it's like it was a watershed moment for guitar, like Hendrix or like any player that comes along and sounds so different, or his, like the tapping thing. I for the life of me, I couldn't figure that out. I'd never seen anybody tap, and he didn't invent that, but I think he integrated it into his playing in such a way that it was it was cool. I think I think just the way he integrated into his style was pretty cool. And they got me right away. I mean, I was into it right away. Even the David Lee Roth shtick, the whole unit just like was this kind of, fire breathing at you, and it resonated with me like I said, as a long-haired stoner rocker guitar player, but I think it's funny. Well, so what were you into back then when it came out, and you were kind of like, you understood the watershed moment of the guitar, but B, you're like, the whole other shtick isn't happening. Back then, were you into like Aerosmith, all that shit, or were you into Mott the Hoople back then? What were you into?
Yeah, I was always into Mott the Hoople and Aerosmith, like very early on, and I kind of stuck with them all through that period. But I was kind of at that given moment in time, I was heavily into Thin Lizzy and UFO. Cool. And, those were two that come to mind right now. And I had a collection of stuff spanning back a few years, so I had a bunch of other classic rock stuff. But I just, I would listen to them, the songs, and I didn't really connect with them. And it just, to me, to my young ears, it just seemed like it was just like shredding for shred's sake. Yeah. And that was before I really got that, that's what it is. I mean, it's like, that's what makes this band unique is, that the way that he incorporates that, kind of like over the top guitar and, into the song. So I think I was just more straight ahead. And you talked about the tapping. I can't even recall ever even trying to do that. It just was something that I thought was cool, like mind blowing, but it was something that I had no interest in even trying to figure out. Maybe I took like a stab at it. And I used to do that thing that I think I've heard you do too, where you bend a string and then you use your index finger up the neck to point and do that. That was about as close as I got to that.
Yeah.
That was more, my favorite, shreddy guitar player back then was Michael Schenker. I've said this before. So, and he's very, structured, melodic, and, there's not a lot of pig squeals and bends. He's mind blowing, but Eddie Van Halen was an entirely different thing. And until I got the package, I, had respect for the guitar player, but, it took me a while to get the entire package, which I think is pretty brilliant.
Yeah. I hear you on that. Well, and the negative aspect of it is it unleashed a whole generation of guitar players that went out and bought the Super Strat with the Floyd Rose and had to, had to tap and do all this other bullshit. That's the negative side of that.
That got old real fast. That whole thing where there was like these, all those hair bands that have their like, 53 seconds or whatever of here's my solo. I'm going to stick it in this song. And I'm not even really listening to the song, but I worked out this solo that I want to interject into this thing because it's my chance to shine. Exactly. And that stuff drove me nuts too. Just, what? And that was absolutely no fault of Edward Van Halen's. That was just, a lot of people glommed onto it, but I had not. So did you find yourself like going, I want to figure this out. I want to learn how to do did you find yourself trying to learn that stuff? Like
I did, but more
big squeals and all that other stuff.
More just I just wanted to figure out what he was doing in terms of tapping, and it wasn't so much that I wanted to incorporate it into my playing. More just I was just curious, like what the fuck is he doing, Right. Because that's kind of what I like to do when I was younger too, is just put a record on it and try to dissect like what is happening here, like what is he doing, and I couldn't until I was just, it was beyond me. And then this friend of mine showed me and he goes, oh, here's what he's doing. I'm like, oh, because I had such a literal perception of guitar playing. You got the pick in your right hand and you're fingering chords in your left hand. That's what you do, right? You strum and you play. It never dawned on me that you would like tap with your right hand
Right.
back then. So until I actually saw it physically happening, I'm like, oh, okay, that's what's going on. But no, it was just more of curiosity, like how is he doing that?
Yeah. The other thing that was kind of odd for me back then that I noticed was I was really into Montrose, and that I always thought that the Montrose record was like, well, let me put it this way. I have this thing that I've said over the years. It's like my favorite Van Halen record is the first Montrose record. And it's a joke. It's a total joke. But if you look at it, here we have this Ted Templeman produced record that is named, the band is named after the hot lead guitarist that makes motorcycle noises and pig squeals and all this other stuff. It's
Right.
like the parallels are pretty, they're there. And I've never heard Eddie Van Halen mention Montrose as kind of an influence, but I always saw that as a big influence. I mean, compare, Ronnie Montrose and Eddie Van Halen. There's going to be a lot more differences than there are similarities.
Yeah.
But that whole thing is just it struck me as like, it was like an aha moment for me. It's like, hey, that's, very Van Halen. And, the melody, that's one thing that I'm really hugely melody and hook oriented.
Yeah.
And I think Van Halen was very hooky. They have but I think it was the way that, the pyrotechniques around the hooks, I found a little bit distracting and didn't allow me to absorb the hooks as fully as I did with something else, if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
But no, I mean, and, I've often found myself saying, well, I like Michael Schenker because he was really melodic, but Eddie Van Halen really melodic, capable of anything. I mean, he can play just about anything, but I think he tended to just to, put more effects and things in the context of a song than like Michael Schenker would lay back. So that's probably that's probably why Schenker spoke to me more, because I'm kind of more of a straight ahead and person. I don't know.
Yeah. And I totally hear that too. And I think I come down on Schenker's side too, for those reasons. Yeah. I think especially as time went on, I think Eddie was just trying to fill space more and more. And it's like, dude, you don't need to fill that much space. I understand what you're trying to do. And I understand what you tried to do in the early days, because essentially musically it was a trio, right? It was a bass, drum, and guitars with a vocal. So he was trying to, fill space, which is cool. You kind of, that's something you kind of think about when you're a trio, but yeah, I think a lot of times it was unnecessary. But I think as terms of a melodic player, he definitely was a melodic player, I think. And if you listen to a lot of cool stuff, like the intro to Women in Love on the second album, that harmonic tapping he's doing is actually a really cool intro to that song. And it's very melodic and it's really cool. So I think there were a lot of, if you listen to his records, there are little flashes of really brilliance, I think, in terms of melody and what he's doing that I really take away and just really appreciate,
Yeah. Dance the Night Away. Hello.
Yeah.
There's more hooks than a bait shop in there. Yeah.
Totally.
And these songs now, especially that one, they're so evocative. Whenever I hear them right now, I just, it takes me right back to that time. I remember hearing Dance the Night Away blasting over, a PA at a dance at school or something like that. And it's just, that stuff is just so evocative of a time. One thing that's really, when you were saying that, I thought of something that I experienced maybe 3 years ago or so. My wife owns a gallery, a boutique gallery shop, and she has in her shop, she has a turntable with a huge shitload of old LPs. And sometimes I was in there after they closed and I was hanging out and I'm like, I want to put on a record. So I went and I found It's Forning. It's the green one that has I Want Some on it. And I put that on and I'm listening to it. What's that?
Women and Children First, I think. Is that it?
Okay. All right. So Women and Children First. And I put that on there and I listened to it both sides. And my thought was, I don't like this at all. This seems like he's phoning it in because, I'm hearing riffs that he did on previous records, just kind of put in there and mixed up a little bit. And it seemed like a very, somebody just putting something together, just, guitar for guitar's sake.
Yeah.
And I'm at that moment in time, it did not really speak to me. And I thought, I don't like this record at all. And after Eddie Van Halen passed, I was very surprised to see some people who, you know, I share musical tastes with that have great music taste, singling out that record as one of their favorite records, which just goes to show you one thing that's so cool about music is it speaks to people in different ways. And the other thing is, like, music is like LSD. Sometimes it's about set and setting. So it could have been the mood that I was in at the time. It just didn't speak to me. But I actually listened to that record. I'm thinking, I had a picture of Eddie Van Halen, listening to all of his reviews, sticking guitar parts. It's like, what can I use? I need something here. Let me grab that from this song. Let me grab that from this song and put it in there. And I didn't like the record at all on that particular listen. So it's really interesting to see. I mean, we're all different. You know what I mean? We're all going to get different things from music. And there's people out there that record spoke to, and it's like their favorite record.
Yeah.
So go figure.
That's what I think is interesting about it too, is just like you're saying, I've talked to so many people about Van Halen and they'll mention an album that I'm like, are you kidding? Like Diver Down or some weird album. And it's like, okay, that's your favorite. That's cool. Like you say, everybody's different. One of the coolest things that I experienced, my friend Mark and I went to the reunion show they did, I think 2015 or something like that. You know, it was with Roth. Wolfgang was on bass, but we had to go because he and I had seen the band when they first started. We saw them open for Sabbath here in Seattle, you know, when they were just starting out, and it was insane. So of course we had to go to this reunion show, and it was mixed, you know, it was bittersweet because they're all old dudes up there, and David Lee Roth just looked like an old man kind of puttering around up on stage, but it was still cool to see. But these people next to us had never seen the original lineup, right? They were younger than us, and they'd probably seen the Hagar years and stuff like that. And so Mark and I were, you know, more than happy to like tell them all of our exploits from the 70s, going to see the original lineup of the band. And they were just you know, blown away. And they were, you know, they were happy to hear all our ridiculous stories about, you know, how we'd gone to see them in the early days. So it was kind of neat to be next to these people who they were kind of psyched to see at least a close facsimile of the original lineup, but not quite. But it was kind of neat to see them so excited to see that, you know, because Mark and I had seen the original lineup, and it was cool, man. It was insane to see that lineup live. It was really cool. You know, if you talk to people that have kind of seen them, I never saw the Hagar years because I don't care for that era at all, or the totally unmentioned Gary Sharon years. But that original lineup, seeing that live was really cool.
In like LA and stuff, when they were just getting started, just how many jaws must have hit the floor.
Oh yeah.
And you posted that link to that video of them at some like
the Hilton,
what was, like a dinner a hotel,
Pasadena in Hilton, the Hilton Hotel. Yeah.
And that was really great for me to listen to because it's Van Halen doing a bunch of cover songs, you know, kind of an impromptu cover song set in a hotel. Everything that made that band incredible is fully in place, and they're doing cover songs. And that for me is one of the most fascinating things, is to see how a band approaches somebody else's songs. And you can separate the great bands from the good cover bands by the way they take what the song, they take something from it, but they inject themselves, and the result that comes out. And that was really cool. I fucking really enjoyed that, because seeing what Eddie Van Halen would play on these classic songs, and just like, it's amazing. And every bit of that band that made them superstars is in place at that time too. Like David Lee Roth, like showmanship with the crowd, but I loved listening to Eddie play stuff, because it wasn't all, you know, parlor tricks and whatnot. It was like he got inside those songs, and he, you know, injected himself, and what came out was pretty remarkable. And that's like, I mean, I've seen tons of cover bands, and it's like, you'll see the bands that just go up there and they're great at aping stuff. And they're like, oh, they got that sound. He's like using chorus on this, and he's got all that. Oh, he played that solo note for note. But then there's the great bands, you know, that take just enough to respect the song and then inject enough of themselves in there. So it's like, yeah, this is a world-class band. Yeah. And on that tape that you posted, it was really fun to listen to. I'll post a link to that on our.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that I really dig cover bands that just have their own twist on songs, because exactly, there's really no point in trying to, especially great songs, like, you know, what are you going to do? You have to try to take a twist on it. But it's so funny. My friend sent me that video. We're talking about Van Halen before they broke, a cover band playing the Pasadena Hilton. And I started the recording, and Eddie Van Halen is trying to tune his fucking guitar, and it's so painful because he's it's almost like he doesn't know how to tune his guitar, and it seems like to go on and on and on, and then they start a song and it just sounds really rough. But as song after song, it starts to dial in, and you're like, damn, like you said, Chris, you can hear like everything's in place. Like, and the cool thing about his playing is, like you said, he's not tapping and he's not doing all this shit. He's just playing really tasteful guitar, you know? And he said many times that like Clapton was one of his biggest influences, right? Which is love or hate Clapton, but you know, Clapton's a pretty understated player for the most part. So, right. And I think for the most part, he tried to serve songs. So you can really kind of hear that, I think, in this early recording of Van Halen, you can kind of hear Eddie, you know, kind of respecting the guys he dug. You know, he's not trying to fill too much space, and he's trying to play tasteful, but it's still him, and it's still unique. Yeah, so we got to post that. We'll post that video on our site. But that's another thing I've dug about. Well, I mean, it's a bummer that he passed, but the thing that I've dug is that I've just read so many interviews or seen so much or heard so much audio that I never knew existed of this band, like from the early years, or heard stories about, like we were talking about Dance the Night Away. Well, I saw this interview with Alex and Eddie, and they didn't really care for that song. In Eddie's mind, it should have sounded different in the recording, but it sounded too pop to them. And early on in their career, they were opening for Black Sabbath, and they loved Black Sabbath because they were heavy and shit like that. And he said he was so embarrassed to do Dance the Night Away live, so that they did it as fast as they could to get it done. So, because they didn't want to feel, you know, they thought maybe like Black Sabbath would go, oh, you pussies are doing that, you know, that pop shit or whatever. But it was pretty funny.
No, it's great. It was a great song. I mean, it was poppy. I can see that. You know, it is pretty like light compared to a lot of their other stuff, but I love it. I mean, it's very evocative. You know, it's infectious.
Yeah,
happier than shit. So I don't have a problem with it.
Oh, I do too. But it's just funny that, you know, their perception of their songs. That's what I think is so fascinating, is to hear an artist talk about their own material and songs they like or hate or whatever that I never would have really thought about. You know, like that whole thing. It's like being in a band, opening for this heavy band, and then you have some songs in your repertoire that you think are kind of lightweight or might be perceived as, you know what I mean? It's just kind of interesting to me to hear them talk about their own material that way.
Another thing that's really important about that band that we haven't touched upon is how much Edward Van Halen brought to getting inside of your instrument, like physically, like I'm going to take this guitar, I'm going to make my guitar. Because he was like one that was really into like pushing his gear to the limits. And if his gear didn't do what he wanted, he was into like getting in there and doing it himself. Yeah. And that, you know, I'm not really aware of very many places where that existed before he came out. I mean, he's probably responsible for all the aftermarket bodies and necks and things like that. So he was huge for that whole movement of like, I'm going to customize my shit. And he could back it up. I mean, if he wants to put a humbucker in a Strat, and, you know, if that's what he gets out of it, well, good for him. I mean, I think that part, you know, I think that helped him get where he was going. You know, you could argue that, you know, he could have just played, you know, a Les Paul or a stock Strat, and he would have been incredible, and he would have been. But I think as far as driving himself, I think him interacting with his instruments that way was very important to his results.
I think that's a great point, man. The thing is, he didn't know anything about it. He didn't know anything about electronics or anything else. He just said, well, I got this pickup. Exactly. And he bought that first body. It was a second. He didn't know what that meant. You know, what does it mean that it's a second? He didn't mean that it was, you know, he didn't know that it was a lesson. So exactly. Yeah. But exactly. I thought that was such a cool thing about him too. And the whole Variac thing, right? Like hooking that Variac up to his amp to crank the shit out of it so he could, you know, work the tubes like you would crank it, but still at, you know, reasonable volumes and stuff. I think you're absolutely right. I think that was another part of his personality that played into his playing and played into his inspiration and fueled him. And another cool thing about him is he had a really good friendship with Les Paul, who was another tinkerer and inventor. So
Right.
he would say that he said in an interview, like Les Paul would call him like at late at night and just say, "What are you working on?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm trying to put sandpaper on a pick because the picks keep falling out of my hand." He goes, "I'm doing the same thing." And so they, he had this kinship with this Les Paul, who was, many years older than him, but they could relate to each other because they were both tinkerers and they both wanted to try to improve their stuff or change it or, yeah. So I
Right.
thought that was really cool.
That's a good point. I totally glossed over that when I was saying that there weren't many people. Certainly Les Paul was one of those people, very much the same. Like, just give me my shit. This isn't working for me. So give me a hammer, a chisel, whatever I need. I'm going to get this. And as a result of interacting with their instruments and, taking them further, it just added to their playing. I mean, just their creativity.
Yeah.
It was all part of that.
I just thought that was such a cool thing because again, like I never saw pictures of them together or anything, but then all of a sudden I see this interview and he's talking about how he and Les Paul had this really great relationship. And I just think that's so cool. And it makes sense, right? For the reasons we just described. They're both tinkerers and they're both kind of inventors. And yeah, and then Eddie went on to
great guitar players.
Totally. Yeah, great guitar players for their own era. One more thing before we wrap it up. Another thing that I found so cool and fascinating is hearing interviews with his son, Wolfgang. He really seems like a genuinely good person. And I think that's a testament to his parents. Who knows how much of it is Eddie and how much of it is his mom. Is probably most his mom, but but also in interviews and things like that, you can tell that Eddie totally loved that kid. I mean, he loved that kid. And
right.
So he was always pushing him to do his own stuff, and he was blown away by his son's music and stuff. So, and really supportive of it. So that was another cool thing to come out of this is just my understanding more about Eddie as a father and how much he loved his son, how much he encouraged his son to play.
Good dude, good guitar player.
Yep.
Yeah. So R.I.P. Eddie Van Halen.
Totally, man. R.I.P. Eddie. We love you. I'm always going to listen to those. Yeah, always going to listen to those two albums. And those early concerts are just embedded in my head. Just all this, everything that was going on. The day, the whole day. Back then, a concert was a day. You'd go to the venue because you had to wait in line. There weren't reserved seats, so it was like, it was like Dazed and Confused. You'd run into all these people, right? Like the drug guy, the woman that was passed out, her purse, the contents of her purse are all over the sidewalk because she's wasted before the show starts. All that crazy stuff is just in my brain, right? Like, it's crazy. All right, man. Well, thanks for listening, people. Go out and listen to some Van Halen, R.I.P. Eddie.
Bye.